Hi, Mike Beckett here from The Dead Prophet. I hope you enjoy this part one of a two-part series as I have a conversation with Brett Dinger and we talk about the journey of Methodism up into present day. Prophet, I'm your host, Mike Beckett. It's a joy, honor, and privilege to have Brett Dinger back on the show. In fact, you were one of the first ones that taped
Yeah, it's been about a year.
with
Yes.
me a while back, and we did discipleship. And now I think if I look this morning, 109 videos later, between shorts and segments and things of that, this is starting to take off now. Someone had said to me a while back, it could take 2 to 5 years for it to really go, and
Sure.
hopefully between the recent book contract and continuing to bring topics in that are, a variety of topics that address all of what we deal with as disciples of Christ. Hopefully, will be the key. So it's good to have you on the
Yeah,
show.
it's good
I
to be here.
know
Thank you.
when we were last on there, it was pre-worship director positions for myself and Shauna. We were
Yep.
members there at Lakeside, and then this opportunity opened for us to become worship directors that literally fell out of the sky. And numerous times we told this church no. And for some reason, this time we said yes. And that's where we're at it today. But
Mhm.
was part of that journey of Methodism during that time, the most recent journey of Methodism.
Mhm.
Methodism has taken quite a few journeys over the history of its founding,
Sure.
and
Absolutely.
so I'd like to take some time this morning and kind of talk about that journey of Methodism and how it brings us up to present day. Because I know there's been changes since we've last talked.
Sure.
Lakeside is now part of the Global Methodist Church, which is
Yeah.
really exciting. And hopefully we'll end up getting to that point to be talking about what the Global Methodist Church is and what's happening there. But take us on a journey, will you, if you can, on Methodism up to the present day.
Sure. Sure. Well, Mike, thanks again for having me on. That first time we were on, we did talk about discipleship, and I was thinking about our conversation today. So much of what we're going to talk about really is is discipleship. And when I think about Methodism, that's what I think about. If there are two things I love to talk about, I would talk about my family and I would talk about my church. And I love Lakeside, and it's really hard to tell the story of Lakeside without kind of putting in the context of the greater Methodist movement. So you're right, we are part of the Global Methodist Church, and I'm excited to talk about that here in a little bit. But I think to really understand how we got to this point today, we have to talk about the long and storied history of Methodism. It's a great history. It's a history uh, that has been filled with all sorts of different times of conflict and tension and revivals and bursts of energy and God has really used the people called Methodist in different places and in different seasons to change the world. And what we've seen is that even out of conflict, and Methodism has been no stranger to conflict. God has just continued to sustain the people called Methodist, and we have different iterations of Methodism over the years, and the Global Methodist Church is one of the more recent ones. But we still believe God is in the midst of the people called Methodist. So Methodism, and some of your listeners will probably know this. If you're not Methodist, or if you don't come from Wesleyan tradition, this might be new to you. But Methodism found its inception in the heart of a man named John Wesley. Wesley was an Anglican cleric, was part of the Church of England, and kind of grew up in the church world. And then when he was a bit older, he had this heartwarming experience, and some say it was a conversion, some say it was a supernatural occurrence of the Holy Spirit, and that really began to kind of change the trajectory and the direction of his life. And he began to seek ways, kind of unconventional ways, to bring the gospel to lost people. And so, as he grew bold in his preaching, he was often banned from preaching in Anglican pulpits, and He was willing to maybe do some of the dirtier work and go outside and preach in places where up until that point it had been kind of off limits. And he just discovered that people were open to receiving the gospel. And that really led to the spread of Methodism. Methodism began, of course, in England, moved its way to America, and there was some conflict and tension with the way Methodism began in America and began to spread and began to grow. And the reality is, for the couple hundred years that Methodism has been alive and well, Methodism has always wrestled with the rise of cultural forces and social realities. And because of that, there are these competing visions and maybe different visions that have formed visions of what it means to live out the gospel today. And it makes sense when I think about Wesley and how he grew and developed in his faith, because he was a man that had a deep conviction that we are to love God with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength, but also love other people. And that in and of itself, of course, that comes from Jesus and the Great Commission. That in and of itself can invite us into some really interesting conversation. So Wesley would talk about acts of piety, these things that we do to connect us to God, but also acts of mercy, things that we should do to kind of stretch out our hands and to love our neighbors, particularly the least of these. And so that's been part of Methodism's DNA. And it's one of the primary reasons why I find myself in the tribe of people known as Methodists, because I think we have some of the best theology in the world. Our practice of our theology has not always been top notch, but I think for me, when I was considering, what branch of Christianity did I want to give my life to, even though I was born into Methodism, I still, grew to the point where I had to make that decision for myself. It was that tension, finding ways to love God and to love others, this vertical and this horizontal way of discipleship. And so the tension, though, that we've seen over the years and over the centuries of Methodism has come when trying to understand what love of God and what love of neighbor means in a very practical sense, particularly when there are cultural forces and social movements and even some political voices that grow and kind of begin to kind of shape the narrative of communities and even nations. And oftentimes in Methodism, that has resulted in the creation of something new, of new expressions. Now, I could give you a whole list of denominations that have come out of John Wesley and his heartwarming faith. We don't have time today to talk about
Right.
all the mergers and separations and
Right.
births. That is just part of the fabric of what it is meant to be Methodist. But I'll
Yeah.
give you one example because it means a lot to me. The Free Methodist Church. The Free Methodist Church broke away from the Methodist Episcopal Church in 1860, again, over issues of the day, things like slavery and the freedom of expression and worship and renting pews. And so those who were of means could have the better pews, and those who didn't were relegated to the back or, in the balcony. And that's just one example of how, Methodism historically has experienced the rise of social tension. We just live in times when we create different branches from the same roots. And why that's meaningful to me is because as painful as that was, I'm sure for the Methodists in the Civil War area, it has had a personal influence on my life. I married a Free Methodist layperson. My wife grew up the daughter of a Free Methodist deacon. So my father-in-law is a retired Free Methodist pastor. We were married by a youth pastor in a Free Methodist tradition, just a great friend of ours. My best friend growing up, my college roommate, was a Free Methodist. And so even out of that struggle, good came out of it, even if it was just personal. And so I have to think that 50 years from now, we're going to look back and we're going to see that even in the midst of current Methodist iterations, that God has been continuing to weave together a story of redemption and a story of hope, because that's who God is, and that's what he always does. he takes our humanity, he takes the good, the bad, and the ugly. He takes what we get right and what we get wrong, and he redeems us and he restores us and he uses us. And I have no doubt that the people called Methodist, whatever name is attached to the church building, that God's going to continue to use us. And so that just gives you just kind of a brief historical look
Mhm.
at the Methodist Church and the struggles that we've had since, really since Wesley had his heartwarming experience.
Right. Right. And I think when we look at cultures and we look at history and we look at, like you had said, those cultural, social, and political views of a particular era that tend to infiltrate a church to where a church comes to the point, whether it was back in the early 1900s, when we kind of see a group of Methodists that break off into what is now the Pentecostal
Sure.
charismatic group. But there were things then. So as you go through history, and it's kind of this I don't know if it's a dichotomy is the word I want to use, but you had said, the journey of Methodism based off of, that whole Great Commission. And it seems like when we get to the litmus test, it seems in the social, cultural, and political voices that grow, the litmus test seems to me that when we realize we have veered off the path of
Mhm.
fulfilling that great commission, and that's going and making disciples of all nations versus going and making, social justice and cultural acceptances and political, happiness. But when we've lost the focus of discipleship, then it's like the church says, okay, we need to take a inward look out here, because what Christ has called us to is to raise up disciples, not
Right.
to copy and stamp the culture and copy and stamp other types of people. It's to copy and stamp and become more like Jesus Christ. Would that be a fair
Exactly.
assessment?
Exactly. Yeah, I agree. I agree. Somebody once said that the good news is bad news first. And we want to get people to the good news, but sometimes that means we have to be okay with confessing the bad news.
Yeah.
And that's just a part of discipleship. It's a part of understanding that we are broken, we are sinful, and we can't lose that focus. Now, there are definitely social consequences to our faith. There are things that we should naturally and supernaturally begin to live out in the social stratosphere. Loving our neighbor. Jesus says in Matthew 25, "What you've done for the least of these, you've done for me." But again, that the focus is on developing an intimate relationship with Jesus and then allowing his love and his light to shine through us. And I think when we invert those sometimes, we can kind of get ourselves into a pickle.
Yeah, true. So without kind of beating a dead horse and beating the elephant in the room, as I call it, um, obviously current recent situations that have taken place that have caused many people to shift to Global Methodist Church, which we're going to get into. What was the church's response to the point to where, okay, we feel it's time we need to recenter back to going and making disciples of Jesus Christ? What was the church's response to that as a whole? I know we'll get into here in a few moments the impact the journey had on your own personal
Mhm.
spiritual journey, because really when you kind of feel like you're upshifting and relocating your tent to a whole
Sure.
unknown region of the land, there's questions. There's, are we doing the right thing? There is,
Yeah.
God, are we listening to your voice? There's all of those things that play into that I'm sure, as a senior pastor and as being on some of the front lines of some of that, I'm sure that had a personal impact on your spiritual journey. But what was the first, I guess, response, the church's response, when we've realized, okay, we need to kind of refocus what we're doing here as a body of believers, and come back to that Great Commission and come back to what,
Yeah.
those Wesleyan truths.
Sure. Sure. Yeah. So I think the word that I would just say would be discernment. I think that early 2019 to kind of 2022, each church kind of entered this season, this period of discernment. And it was a very challenging season. But even though it was challenging, I found it to be be good. The discernment itself was a gift, and I don't know how churches have functioned around discernment in past years. And I know that for me, that this challenged me as a leader probably more than anything else, and it drew me closer to the Lord. Now I'll talk about that here in a little bit, but it was really challenging because so much of us had a deep love and appreciation, and we still do for a denomination that did a lot of good for us. I was I was born and raised as a United Methodist.
Yeah,
I
me
was
too.
baptized a United Methodist. I was married in a United Methodist church. I was ordained in a United Methodist church. I received my first appointment. I had so many opportunities afforded to me by a denomination that I loved, and in many ways I still do. I still have colleagues and friends, and well, I'm cheering them on. I'm praying for them. I want to see God do a mighty work in them. But for us here at Lakeside, it was really healthy for us. It was good for us because we were afforded the opportunity to do some work that we hadn't done in quite some time. And that time of discernment I think, was clarifying. I would say it was galvanizing for us. I would say that it was renewing in a sense. It was very renewing. And I think that even if we had not made the decision that we made to disaffiliate, that the time of discernment we were afforded was healthy, it was essential, and it was for our good. And I really believe that, regardless of where we ended up, it would have been used for God's glory. So when I think back to those years, we were invited to remember who we've been in our past. And so to remember the stories of previous iterations of Lakeside and pastors and ministry. And that, of course, that DNA is kind of still within us. And so remembering who we've been also helps us remember who God has called us to be. It drew us together and it unified us. We experienced just a wonderful unity and time of unity as we were having these really hard and challenging and difficult conversations. It helped us remember our story, and I think over time we kind of forget where we've been and where we've come from and what we experienced. And as new people come into the church, it's good to remember our story. It's good to be able to tell people this is who Lakeside is. And we found ourselves just seeking God's presence and seeking God's will for us. You and your wife were a part of some of these. We set aside seasons and nights and times of prayer. We had congregational conversations. We did Bible studies. We had kind of Q&A sessions. We did a lot of reading, and I would have people come into the office just, every so often they pop in and we would just sit down for an hour and just talk about meaningful stuff.
Yeah.
And and it all just occurred in the context of a Methodism that was changing.
Mhm.
We drew near to the Lord, and we discovered that James was right when he says, "Draw near to the Lord, and He will draw near to you."
Yeah.
We experienced that. And in the end, disaffiliation pathways opened up, and as we leaned into those conversations, we felt that our spiritual home, our next spiritual home, would be with the Global Methodist Church.
Yeah. I remember one of the meetings that I was not at. I remember my wife coming home and telling me, and when churches go through what you would consider, I mean, culture would call it a split, but when churches kind of go through this discernment phase of, okay, I think it's time for us to move on. I remember my wife had said that the bishop had come down from the previous one, and you would think that the attitude of people would be like throwing stones, but I remember my wife said that we prayed for her,
Yeah.
prayed for what she has to bear as well as a burden instead of coming, well, ha ha ha, point fingers. It's like, look, we're all brothers and sisters of Jesus Christ. And we want to make sure we all make the right decision to follow what God has called us to do for those next steps. And I thought that was really inspiring.
Absolutely.
And to me, that says something about the integrity and character of a church. And
Yeah.
really, again, coming back to reflect the true um, unity of Christ and true heart of Christ. And
Yes, absolutely.
I just thought that when she came home and shared that, I was like, that is just so amazing because I have seen in my years, in a lot of Pentecostal circles, when churches split, they get mad because the color of the carpet, and they're like throwing stones and Bibles.
Right.
It's like, wait a second here, carpet's not the issue, you know. But that was encouraging. So it seems that continuing to follow that desire that Wesley had from the beginning, again, going back to the Great Commission and following as Christ would have done it. Now, obviously, this probably had an impact on your own personal spiritual journey. I'm sure there were some growth spurts. I'm sure you were sitting there thinking to yourself, shaking your head, God, what are you doing to me? I don't understand. Because like you said, all you've known.
Right.
You've been there,
Yeah.
done that, and then now God is shifting and causing you to think, okay, I think there's something better for our body to help us to grow deeper into our relationship with Jesus Christ. So tell me
Yeah.
about some of those feelings and some of the things that maybe you were struggling with, or some of the things that God showed you about yourself that you really were
Mhm.
like, wow, now I can see. Because when we're going through it, we can't see what's on the other side of
Right.
that wall. And I remember you and I would talk in our discipleship book we were going through, just with own personal struggles of things like that. But
Yeah.
it's just interesting to hear what impact did that have on your spiritual growth, and what did God show you about yourself in the midst of that whole
Mhm.
journey?
Well, unfortunately, I probably put on a few pounds during that conversation and have a few more gray hairs because of it. Because listen, change is not easy and leadership is hard. Leadership is hard. But I think I learned how to lead. I remember putting a post out on Twitter, or maybe now it's X, saying that I thought COVID was going to be my biggest leadership challenge in life. And then I found out that, on the heels of COVID came this conversation, and I just had to learn really quick to lean into discomfort. Okay, so I think that's the first thing I'll say is that just, kind of leaning into hard conversations, not that they became easy, they became necessary. And and I think that's a gift that the Lord uh, opened up to me in the midst of these disaffiliation conversations. Um, and now I know, and I tell my staff this all the time, that if there's a hard conversation to have, just have it. Have the hard conversation. Don't avoid it. Don't put it off. Lean into it. As hard and as stressful as it may be, in the end, it's just better that way. It's better to go through the hard stuff than to ignore it and pretend that it will go away on its own.